I am, by birth, Genovese, and my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My ancestors had been for many years counselors and syndics, and my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and indefatigable attention to public business. He passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country. A variety of circumstances had prevented his marrying early, nor was it until the decline of life that he became a husband and the father of a family. Long considered one of the greatest novels of all time and long considered the very first science fiction novel, Frankenstein by Mary Shelley holds a place near and dear to the heart of all of literature. But what evil exists inside this novel? Join me as we go chapter by chapter through Frankenstein. This is the first video in this series, and it will contain 3 separate parts. Number 1, a So What Happened recap of the portion of the novel we just read. Number 2, a literary criticism section where we talk about all of the literary ins and outs that Chapter 1 presented. And finally, a writer's corner, notes that we can take from this first chapter as writers ourselves. So, what happened? We hear the story of Beaufort, a merchant friend of our narrator's father who goes bankrupt and then goes into self-imposed exile out of shame. Eventually, he died of melodrama. Mostly. Naturally, our narrator's father is worried about his dead buddy's daughter, so he sends her to Geneva. Oh, and marries her. The two parent our narrator in Naples, so, though he introduces himself as Genovese by birth, it seems he is Neapolitan. But it's rare in this day and age for someone to introduce himself as 1/3 strawberry. Still, as a rich couple, they make a habit of visiting poor folk. One day, while visiting another litter of the underclass, our narrator's mother is particularly taken by a little girl who is decidedly more celestial than her siblings. Seems she was stamped by the upper class because the baby did not belong to the peasants with whom she was housed. The baby was of noble descent, but her mother had died in birth and her father had fallen through political misfortune. The fair child is commandeered by our speaker's mother. Her name is Elizabeth, and everyone loves her, especially our narrator's mother. But especially our narrator. Also, our narrator's name is Victor. He's sort of important in this story. This video exists in 2 separate playlists here on the channel. Number 1 being a chapter-by-chapter read-along for Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. Number 2 being Horror Fest 2024, a playlist of 31 videos in the 31 days of October for horror-related literature. But don't be afraid to check out the darkest playlist here on the channel, a playlist of videos dedicated to the darkest aspects of literature. There is also a playlist dedicated to Edgar Allan Poe and full-length read-alongs for The Shining by Stephen King as well as Carrie by Stephen King. So despite the fact that we have a very short opening opening stave to this novel known as Frankenstein, there are already some interesting things going on. And I want to start by talking about the opening paragraph. Maybe you caught on to this as well. I am by birth Genovese, and my family is one of the most distinguished of that republic. My ancestors had been for many years counselors and syndics, and my father had filled several public situations with honor and reputation. He was respected by all who knew him for his integrity and indefatigable attention to public business. He passed his younger days perpetually occupied by the affairs of his country. A variety of circumstances had prevented his marrying early, nor was it until the decline of life that he became a husband and the father of a family. Very, very self-conscious there that I want to remind you just right off the bat, not that this is going to go anywhere, not that anything is going to happen on this front, but my family is very distinguished. We're good people. You know that. You know us. I'm of that same lineage. Good people through and through. We're all great guys. We have this guilty conscience being sort of explained away in an opening paragraph that no, I'm not. Maybe you've heard some things. Perhaps there's something that you think you know, but look, I'm of good stock. Upper class, don't you know? And then, immediately following this, as the circumstances of his marriage illustrate his character, I cannot refrain from relating them. One of his most intimate friends was a merchant who, from a flourishing state, fell, through numerous mischances, into poverty. This man, whose name was Beaufort, was of a proud and unbending disposition, and could not bear to live in poverty. How terrible! And oblivion in the same country where he had formerly been distinguished for his rank and magnificence, having paid his debts, therefore, in the most honorable manner, he retreated with his daughter to the town of Lucerne. This is the story of a fall. We have a previously great man who has fallen on hard times. So we start this chapter by letting you know how respectable this family really is, and then we set the table for a fall. Is there something to be done with that question of a fallen man in this greater story? Now, to stay on that same idea here, we have the story. No, so very short opening paragraph. Didn't count the words, or very short opening chapter. Didn't count the words. I'm assuming this is right around 2,000 words of an opening paragraph. In these opening 2,000 words, we have two fallen men and two fallen women. Two people, two men of respectable stature, respectable status, who had fallen from their place in society, and two women, two girls, really, who suffer because of that. We have the Beaufort in question, our narrator's father's friend, who has fallen and takes his daughter with him. And then we have Elizabeth's father, who had fallen through some type of political upheaval in his country. He fell, and his daughter fell as well. That's four fallen people in 2,000-ish words. Every 500 words in this opening chapter, we have someone who has fallen. Very interesting, very, very thematic for the opening paragraph. Why do I keep saying for the opening chapter? And it's something that I think we have to keep an eye on moving forward. The third thing I want to talk about here is not really a big talking point because there's not a whole lot made of it in this opening paragraph, but it is certainly there, and it's there by assumption. We have our narrator's father marrying his fallen friend's daughter. Basically, you get the idea here, basically, because it sure would be a shame. Sure would be a shame if she fell out of that upper class. And then you have later Elizabeth being spotted by our narrator's mother in this litter of the unfortunate. This veritable pound for miscreants that are the peasants where Elizabeth is found. She just wasn't like the rest of them. She was more celestial. She is of upper class stock and is immediately identifiable thereof. This question of class, this question of status, these things where this is really an older idea, right? That people are immediately recognizable by their stock and breed. Sort of a throwback, a hearkening back to a time where certain people were just favored by God. These were the kings. These were the euhemerized individuals who would become gods. This was Achilles. These people born so beautiful, so much more beautiful than the rest of us commoners, immediately recognizable as upper class, immediately recognizable as someone of status. So those are some ideas to play with here as well. But the last talking point for the literary criticism section that I want to get into is in the very last paragraph of the chapter here. And we have Victor, our narrator, who we're going to get to know a little bit better, talking about Elizabeth and going on about how much he loves her. Everyone loved Elizabeth. We get this quote: "On the evening previous to her being brought to my home, my mother had said playfully, 'I have a present for my Victor. Tomorrow he shall have it.' And when, on the morrow, she presented Elizabeth to me as her promised gift, I, with childish seriousness, interpreted her words literally, and looked upon Elizabeth as mine to protect and cherish, mine to protect, love, and cherish. All praises bestowed upon her I received as made to a possession of my own. We called each other familiarly by the name of cousin. No word, no expression could body forth the kind of relation in which she stood to me, my more than sister, since till death she was to be mine only." These ideas of ownership and death. Ownership and death. Ownership of a person, ownership of a person's autonomy, ownership of a person's very being. She was mine to love, cherish, and protect. She was mine to do these things with. She was mine to control in this way. She was under my control. So we have an interesting dynamic set up here. This idea of Elizabeth and our narrator's mother, they are very much the same, meaning that our narrator's father and our narrator, Victor, are very much the same. Elizabeth has fallen in life the very same way that our narrator's mother had fallen in life. Our narrator's mother is dependent upon someone of the upper class finding her and yanking her back up to upper class status. Elizabeth, at the end of this chapter, has fallen and is very much dependent upon our narrator's mother finding her and yanking her back up to upper class status. Elizabeth and our narrator's mother's stories thus far are the same. So too, in some ways, are the stories of Victor and his father. Because we are seeing these parallels, because we understand the parallel between Victor and Elizabeth being similar to the parallel between Victor's father and Victor's mother, are we then to assume that Victor's father, in the same way, on some level, controls Victor's mother. Should we look for that type of dynamic moving forward in this novel as well? Sometimes, especially with sort of the classics, the books that will live forever like Frankenstein, I think one of the more interesting things to approach lessons that we can take from a text as a writer, well, it's the things that you can't get away with. This So there's a term in creative writing known as in media res, which means basically in the middle of things, where you start a story with some action, and the reader has to pick up along the way who the character is we're following, what the situation is that's happening, all of these different things to keep up with the story. The reader has to put these things together on the fly, has to put these things together, and it becomes an interesting situation for the reader. There is some idea that this is an emergent property, that a couple hundred years ago, to be placed in the middle of a story at the beginning of a story would have been off-putting because people wanted things introduced. But now we are so familiar with texts that we have to be placed in the middle of things, otherwise we can't really get interested. We have all of these tools that we've picked up from television and movies and reading other stories and short stories and poetry, whereby we become complacent if we are fed the beginning of a story like we are fed the beginning of this story. Are you likely to be able to get a novel published today where the main thrust of the story is something that Victor has done? And here we have Victor's story beginning with Victor's parents. We are going all the way back pre-Victor to start a story in Victor's life. Unlikely. Would this story be more interesting to us without that bit of hand-holding at the beginning? I think probably quite likely that would be the case. If we started this story somewhere else and got all of these details with Elizabeth and our speaker's mother and our speaker's father sort of sprinkled in along the way, the book itself would be more of a puzzle to put together. So it is interesting that these things have come up in this way. Now, the second point here to make about writing is audience awareness. We have this passage towards the end of the chapter. For a long time, I was their only care. My mother had much desired to have a daughter, but I continued their single offspring. When I was about 5 years old, while making an excursion beyond the frontiers of Italy, they passed a week on the shores of the Lake Como. Their benevolent disposition often made them enter the cottages of the poor. This, to my this, to my mother, was more than a duty, it was a necessity, a passion, remembering what she had suffered. So, yes, this gives us some character building for Victor's mother, but the way that this paragraph, I think, would come across today is as hoity-toity, is as snooty, is as condescending, all of these sorts of things. So, having a little bit of audience awareness, this mother reads differently to you and I than she would have in the early 1800s, in the mid 1800s, in the late 1800s. This character of the mother is meant to be passed off as charitable, but I think in many ways comes across as condescending, checking in on the lesser folk, hoping to lend a hand. But if we recognize someone that deserves to be of upper class status, we're just going to go ahead and take them, right? We will leave you all of your other children, and we will visit you from time to time. But that child that deserves more because she was of high esteem will come with us. Now, here's an interesting thing, though. How does this text play between the ages? I think anyone who's reading Frankenstein is able to say, okay, well, this person isn't meant to come across as hoity-toity. This is something that she is doing out of the kindness of her heart. But people who are reading are, in the day that Frankenstein was published, more of that class than the lower class. The practice of reading in that day was not really seen as something all that practical, and certainly wasn't necessarily seen as we see it today as being done by people who are studious. It was something more of a waste of time. You can go all the way to Abraham Lincoln, who died in 1865. Abraham Lincoln was a voracious reader as a child and was looked upon as lazy and dumb because of it. So the world in which this novel was written was a world where the people reading it would have been, more than likely, of the class of individuals who were stopping in to check on the poor rather than the poor themselves. So it's just an interesting thing to consider there. How does time change the way that a text is interpreted? If you are writing your piece if you are writing a piece that is from a different time, how do some of those presumed ideas translate? The presumed idea of the charitable upper class versus today, the lower class might look on these people with suspicion. And the final note here for this is just an interest. So I think that, again, that idea of class, which is sort of bred into this novel and has made its way through the writing, still you have to be, if you are the writer of a novel, of a piece, of a text, you have to be cognizant of the way things sound when they are on paper. Right after that first quote there, we get this. She found a peasant and his wife, hard-working, bent down by care and labor, distributing a scanty meal to 5 hungry babes. Among these there was one which attracted my mother far and above the rest. She appeared of a different stock. The 4 others were dark-eyed, hardy little vagrants. if the rest of this introductory chapter does not sound condescending, surely calling peasant children hardy little vagrants does. So I think that just the being cognizant of the phrasing that you use is something that is necessary. uh, when it's easy to get lost in your own words, I think, is an easier way to say this, easier way to communicate this. It's easy to get lost in your own words and not recognize some of the phrases that you're using and how those phrases might come across to others.